Hello. I'd like to begin here by talking about how subsistence strategies changed over time in the course of human history from a world where everyone was living as hunter-gatherers to a situation where some began to use alternative approaches. Hunting and gathering involves an emphasis on wild resources, although many hunter-gatherers do in fact cultivate small amounts of medicinal and other plants because their knowledge about plants is extensive. Today, or at least in the ethnographic present, as it's called, it was only found in recent times in more marginal environments where agriculture was not feasible. But 12,000 years ago, every human population was hunting and gathering. The range of variability, even among those that were documented in historic times, ranges from small mobile bands of desert foragers in places like the Kalahari or Central Australia to the large towns of the northwest coast. And the population density of hunter-gatherers is dependent upon the richness of the environment and the capacity of local technology to access, exploit, and process the resources present. The land use of hunter-gatherers often involves carefully planning that use and managing those resources. And the organization and distribution of labor at the communal level is very necessary. Cooperation within the group is essential for survival and greatly increases the economic productivity of the group. Also, of supreme importance here is the transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next. The amount of information that's necessary for people to be able to make use of naturally available resources, hunting and gathering, knowing when and where and how to exploit these things, what things are toxic, what things have toxins that can be processed out. All of that is the cumulative result of thousands of years of landscape learning and learning about the natural world. The amount of empirical information from observations and experiences that's passed on from one generation to the next in hunting and gathering communities is absolutely immense. Probably in terms of raw amounts of information about different plants, different animals, different landscapes, probably exceeds that of even advanced farming communities. And for this reason, hunter-gatherers were able to occupy the entire planet. Even some landscapes that farming communities were unable to survive in, hunting and gathering gave people a means to underwrite the colonization of all the continents in the world far earlier than the emergence and spread of agriculture. And these traditions are ones that are part of the background of many, many people around the world. All of us have hunting and gathering people as our ancestors, some more recently than others. And it is true that these communities, because they're not conducting massive transformation of the environment, are more vulnerable to changes in that environment. And because their populations tend to not be as large as those of intensive agriculturalists, they are more vulnerable to the impacts of the modern world system. One group that you may be aware of on the northwest coast of North America, here on the west coast of Canada, you have the Haida, one of the remarkable maritime hunting and gathering groups of the Pacific Northwest. And the Haida had an incredible tradition of boat building and trade and exchange that stretched all across the northwest coast and lived in towns of hundreds and occasionally over 1,000 people. So your image that many have of tiny little groups of Inupiaq in igloos or something like that, or people in the Kalahari, that's only one end of the spectrum of variability in hunter-gatherers. Hunters and gatherers often demonstrated gender divisions of labor, although this is usually assumed rather than demonstrated in archaeological situations. In many cases, women did in fact participate in hunting, and men participated in gathering. And it's not just an unusual circumstance where men contribute or women participate in hunting. It tended to be a truism, however, that regardless of what the activity, women worked more than men, and the choices that they made tended to be ones that were more based upon consistent returns. Men were more frequently making choices that could have ended up with zero return, and so probably around half the time the men would be unsuccessful in their activities and rely upon the labor of the women for their daily bread, as it were. The end of the Paleolithic that we've talked about before is when we begin to see the earliest major shifts in how people choose to interact with the landscape. Around 18,000 years ago, we begin to see the end of the Würm glaciation, how it's called in Europe. It's called the Wisconsin glaciation in the Americas. After about 18,000 years ago, when it reached its peak, the ice began to recede. Rapid ablation, or melting of the glacial masses, did not begin until around 16,000 BP, and the first major pulse of meltwater into the world's oceans was not discharged until around 14,500 years ago. Keep in mind, glaciers aren't on treads. They don't roll forward or roll back. So they advance by essentially being pushed down by the weight in the center, and it's like sliding across the surface. But when they melt at that front, and so it just leaves everything behind, like an ice cube. This is what the world looked like around 18,000 years ago. You can see some very significant changes in waterways and whatnot. You can see much of Indonesia is attached to Southeast Asia. New Guinea is attached to Australia. There's almost no Persian Gulf to speak of. The English Channel is not there. It's a giant river valley, actually, at that time. Florida is much larger. And if you go around this map, you can see changes other than the one that we talked about before with Beringia. So it's a very different world at the very tail end of the Ice Age. As the ice began to rapidly melt after 14,500 years ago, the sea rises, and this floods many areas, including Beringia and other highly productive low-lying areas, forcing coastal populations to migrate. The drought conditions that persist during high glacial periods were ameliorated by higher precipitation. There's more meltwater, there's more evaporation, there's more clouds, there's more rain, and this increases terrestrial productivity in some areas. However, this led to the development of larger human populations in areas like the Near East and the Levant, with their wild grasses and grazing animals that were native to that area. But keep in mind that this transition to agriculture was a process embedded within the collection of wild resources, not something alien to it. It wasn't something that people started doing that they hadn't been doing before. The ancestors of wheat and barley and lentils and all of that were wild plants that people were hunting and gathering, not hunting plants, but that people were gathering during the late Paleolithic. And those wild ancestors then became part of a new human subsistence strategy that involves the domestication of plants and animals. The process of domestication, in contrast to hunting and gathering as a way of life, implies modifying the environment in order to exploit it more effectively. Both animals and plants can be modified as a result of human intervention, domestication, and ultimately this transforms the landscape itself. The biggest question is, why did agriculture arise in the first place? If people had been doing hunting and gathering for tens of thousands of years prior to this. Well, what are the effects of farming? The growing of a single crop in a field, by definition, substitutes a biological monoculture for the complex ecological system that existed on the same ground previously. This change has several effects. The quantity of food is greatly increased. Instead of having wild patches of cereal crops, cereal grains, you've got a whole field jam-packed with it, right? But there are costs to this strategy. Over a relatively short period of time, this monocropping can deplete even very fertile areas. This was a problem that rendered many early agricultural sites uninhabitable after a time, and it is still a very serious problem even here in California, in places like the Central Valley. The unintended effects of this process of moving plants around the landscape so that they're closer to the village, for example, collecting some seeds, and rather than having to walk 5 miles that way, you figure out how to distribute them, transplant them basically so that they're closer by. So the human farmers are consciously altering the environment and selecting for the plants they need. They're also selecting for any organism that can live on wheat, for example. Wheat eating vermin, pathogens, diseases of wheat, and whatnot do better in a jam-packed full field than they do when there's little patches of it scattered across the landscape. So paradoxically, by increasing their food supply, farmers simultaneously increased threats to their food supply. Farming may also create a biological system that really lacks flexibility to resist disease or climatic changes. For example, the Great Potato Famine in Europe is a classic case. The Andean farmers from places like Peru and Bolivia that initially domesticated the potato grew a huge variety of potatoes in an effort to maintain diversity. That diversity, some varieties do better when it's a colder year, and some varieties do better when it's a warmer year. Some do better when it's dry, some do better when it's cold. So you grow all of them in the field. That way, regardless of whether the year is hot or cold or wet or dry, some of them will produce. Now, what this ends up doing in any given year, you might look at this and say, well, you're reducing your productivity. You're only getting 75% of the productivity that you could if you could predict what the conditions would be and just plant that one kind of potato that's going to give you the maximum return. You're right. But that's gambling. And in terms of some of these intensive agriculturalists where you've got large cities and populations like they did in the region of the Inca Empire, for example, you may prefer to know how much you're going to get. Let's say you know we're going to get a 75% of the possible crop, but that tells us we know we're going to have 47 bushels out of this field. Because your planning isn't just about trying to maximize the crops. Your planning is about distributing those resources and that food to large, urban populations. And so sometimes it's better to get 75% of the maximum and know that you're going to get 75% of the maximum rather than hoping that you're going to get 110%, right? It's about predictability. And it's because those Andean farmers had thousands of years of familiarity with the domesticated potato, and they knew all of the different risks associated with it. The European populations in places like Ireland and Poland and whatnot that adopted this didn't have thousands of years of experience. They didn't know what the risks were. They didn't know about the blight. They didn't know how to avoid creating those kinds of circumstances. And as a result, they got great productivity for a number of years. Populations increased in places like Ireland, and then when the foundational crop collapses as a result of a pathogen, there's no food. So many people died as a result of the potato famine that there are still fewer people living in Ireland today than were living there in the early 19th century. That's how long it takes for some of these things to recover. The process of domestication is important here. It is a process rather than an event. You begin with a high degree of familiarity with wild plant foods. And over time and experimentation and conscious manipulation, humans themselves create a selective force, choosing those characteristics they find most favorable about a plant or animal and propagating that by breeding that animal more frequently than the ones that don't have favorable traits. The ones that don't have favorable traits become dinner. With plants, selecting the seeds of the best example and saving those and making those your seed crops rather than just randomly selecting. And in the case of the wild grains, they got changed genetically in the process because one of the key things that changes for wheat is that the seed stays on the stalk even after it dries and you harvest it. In the wild, grass seeds, if you just bump against the shaft of the dry grass, fall off. Think about foxtails in your socks, right? But they selected for the crops that didn't fall off, this tough, attachment between the seed and the stalk that made them much easier to harvest later in their development, so that you can let them get completely ripe, let the grains get as big as they possibly could before you harvested them. When they were harvesting the wild grains, they had to harvest them before they got to full size, because when they get to full size, they have a tendency to fall off and propagate. That's how plants get their seeds to move around. But this is changing the purpose of these characteristics in the plant from something that serves the plant's interests to something that serves human interests. And so when they would harvest these in the wild, the ones that stayed on the stalk more would be the ones that would end up making their way back to the village. The ones that fell off easily wouldn't make their way back to the village. And then planting those seeds, essentially transplanting these stands, planting those seeds closer to the village, meant that the next year you'd gradually increase the number of seeds that cling to the stalk in the next crop. And over time, the percentage of wheat and barley seed that falls off the stalk when ripened declined and made the harvesting easier. But here's the real kicker, right? In this way, these crops were domesticated to the point where they cannot reproduce themselves without human intervention. And this is really the hallmark of what it means to be domesticated, that they are dependent upon human intervention. They cannot make it in the wild on their own. So, agriculture also means sedentism. You need to live permanently in one place. You can't be wandering around and going over here to the mountains and then coming down for the salmon harvest and relocating the village, because you can't relocate that stand of crops, right? That stand of crops is going to be there until it is ripe. And then when it's ripe, you have to harvest it. And you have to harvest and you get a big surplus. We already talked about that. You get a big surplus, and with that big surplus means you have to store it someplace, right? And so living in one spot was new for people, and this meant exploiting a relatively small amount of land very intensively, rather than exploiting a large amount of land extensively with a light footprint, as hunter-gatherers did, and over a long period of time. You become dependent on a few plants. And this meant that early nutrition for early farming communities was not as good as it was for hunter-gatherers, because you got wheat and barley and some lentils and, if you were lucky, some goat, meat and milk in the early Neolithic. You didn't get all of these different fruits and greens and different kinds of animals and seafood and etc. You got a very narrow range of resources that you were dependent on. And so we actually do see a decline in stature in early agricultural communities compared to their hunter-gatherer predecessors. So making more food and making more nutritious food was not the reason why people adopted this. It was about living in one place. You're also more vulnerable to the weather. These weather patterns, fluctuate, and these few plants have a certain range of preferences, right? So you're hoping that this spot that you've picked has the conditions for these plants that you've picked and these animals that you've picked. Whereas hunter-gatherers were able to try for one thing. Oh, if it's not working, well, then we've got, four other options that we have open to us. We can, if the salmon aren't doing it this year, then we'll hunt more deer. If the, acorn harvest isn't great, then we'll go higher up the mountain and we'll harvest pine nuts. You can adjust and adapt to a wider range of options as a hunter-gatherer. Again, you don't get as much of a return, right? But you have a diversified portfolio, so to speak. Think about, agriculturalists as having, one stock in the market and hoping that works out. And it continues, though, the ancient dependency of human life on natural ecological systems like the weather cycle, but agriculture raises the odds of disaster in any given year. And you're completely dependent upon harvest times, right? You have to gather all of your food for the year at 1 or 2 or 3 in very remarkable places, like the Valley of Mexico or the Colorado River, places like that. But other places, you've got, further, especially in more temperate, cooler climates, you've got one harvest. So nothing can be allowed to interrupt that harvest. There's a similarly very narrow window of opportunity for planting and cultivating. Under this kind of pressure, agricultural communities became more time conscious, right? And they have to store this and store the produce and protect it from moisture, vermin, thieves, and dole out the supplies in measured quantities so the community can survive and have seed for next year's planting. And so this all created a whole new kind of lifestyle and social relations within the communities from how it had been before. You also have a need for intense physical labor. Agriculture requires intense and sustained physical effort, drudgery, at several times of the year and on a scale previously unknown. Hunter-gatherers work intensively, maybe 20 hours a week on average. Obviously, during times like the salmon run, you're working, 16 hours a day because the salmon are only going to be here for a month or so. But then the averaging out over the course of the year still comes out to be less than about 20 hours a week. The labor of both men and women was required in the fields. So you have less of a gender division of labor in terms of the production of food than you do among hunter-gatherers. But these fundamental conditions of survival encouraged the development of more complex social and individual discipline. The new way of life molded humans and society in new ways, rather than a very kind of individual contribution to the greater whole, this communal organization where everyone had relatively equal access to resources. In hunter and gatherer communities, there's really no such thing as, a rich family living next to a family that's starving to death. The societies don't organize themselves that way. You don't see the development of those kinds of basic inequalities in hunting and gathering communities. And that's something that only occurs after the development of agriculture, and in fact, not even agriculture, but hierarchical societies that we'll talk about in a later lecture. Also, this population growth of people living in one place for a sustained period of time, living in close proximity to animals, was really the source of many of the epidemic diseases that we see today. Measles, smallpox, influenza, all of these are products of the agricultural revolution because many of them are trans-species diseases. They're not native to primates even. For example, smallpox comes from cattle. It comes from cows originally, cowpox. Influenza can come from Pigs are one of the major sources, but also birds. So it's having a chicken coop, having a pig farm, having a herd of cattle that actually leads to these diseases entering into the human populations. And so this has had a huge impact on history. And it's one of the reasons why the ancestors of Native American populations today, they arrived, if you recall from the previous lecture, they arrived before the development of agriculture. And so they did not have any resistance to these diseases from pigs and cows and chickens because those animals, those domesticated animals, were not present in the New World. And so these were completely novel diseases that hit the Native American populations when they came into contact with Europeans. While some natural food resources, like I was talking about with salmon, are abundant but seasonal, they can be gathered while available and stored on a large scale once transformed through appropriate food processing techniques and become a staple food year-round. But around 10,000 years ago, plant resources became relatively abundant in fertile areas. The idea of an abundant food supply that could be processed and stored on a year-round basis was a new one, with profound implications to human existence. Two factors conditioned human response at this time: conspicuous seasonal variability and a storage-based subsistence strategy. If in the face of conspicuous or abundance, people opted to process and store portions of this surplus, then they'd be able to settle down in one area on a year-round basis. So this, for the first time, changed societies from a mobile way of life to one of sedentism. It's clear that this is not a process that happened overnight. It was probably associated with a decreased reliance on mobility as a strategy to seasonally exploit a variety of resources. And what's really fascinating is that these early centuries of dependence upon agriculture look remarkably similar in different parts of the world, at different points in time as well. In the southwest of the United States, Native American communities there really began to be heavily dependent upon agriculture about 2,000 years ago. This was a process that had occurred in a very similar arid landscape in the Near East over 10,000 years ago. But the architecture and the kinds of storage units and the structures even of those societies share a great deal in common. You can see different kinds of permanent and semi-permanent structures, hunter-gatherer types of structures right there in the bottom middle for mobile hunter-gatherers, northwest coast with more sedentary hunter-gatherers, and then you can see these sort of early agricultural pit houses and then more developed southwestern Puebloan structures, which look remarkably similar to Neolithic structures from places like eastern Turkey, Jordan, and the Jordan River Valley. And so you can check on some of these sources here, if you wish, for more about those architectural similarities.